Good morning, my second graders. Today we are going to learn the basics on watercolor painting. You already have the basics of art elements, so now we're going to move on to watercolor paintings. Our goals will be to learn and experiment with how to manipulate a new art medium. Students will know what wet on wet and a wet on dry wash is. Students will know how to choose good art materials for watercolor, and they will know how to create a dark and light value of a single hue. Once these steps are mastered, we will explore our new unit of picture book illustrators, and students will create their own character and story of their own with watercolor painting techniques. So, I will provide you with paper. This is cold press paper. It is my preferred paper to use because of the tooth or texture on the paper. I like the way it reacts to the water and the paint, but there is also hot press paper, which is a smoother surface, and I will provide you with both options so that you may experiment. I will also provide you with watercolor paint brushes. These are different from oil painting brushes because these are soft and bouncy and springy, and they absorb the water and the paint, so only use these ones that I give you. I will also provide you with a water cup and your watercolor paints. So let's begin. First, I wet my paintbrush. Can wring it out a little, you only want it damp. And then you wet the section of your paper for your wet on wet wash. Just get this section damp, do not get your paper too wet. Also notice how I'm holding my brush. Hold it to the side so that the bristles can glide easily over the paper. So my paper is currently damp. I'm going to go to my paints, grab just a little bit of color. See how the water is activating the color? So I've now loaded my brush with the paint, and I'm going to go over this section that I just covered with water. Notice how the color spreads itself across this wet section on my paper. This is how you do a wet on wet wash. You wet your paper, get your paint on your wet paintbrush, and then you paint. So for a wet on dry wash, I'm going to re-wet my paintbrush, wring it out just a little. I'm going to grab a new color, and I'll return to my paper for a wet on dry wash. So notice how I didn't wet my paper first with this wash. You can wet your brush again and return back for more color. Notice how the more color you add, the darker it gets. So you'll get a different effect from both, and if you keep your brush dry, you can drag it across your paper and get this cool textured look. So experiment with these. What happens when you use more water or less water? What happens when you use more color or less color? So for your assignment, you're going to be making color value scales of a single hue of color. Here I'm going to require you to do one with a wet on wet wash, and I'm going to require you to do another with a wet on dry wash. I'll show you how. So first I'm going to do my wet on wet wash. My brush still has a little bit of red, but that's okay. I return to my water and wet my paper where I'm going to put the paint. So remember, our value scale means that we're going to be starting with the darkest value of a color and go to a lighter value. So I loaded up my brush a lot with the blue, and I'm going to start on the far left. To lessen the pigment on my brush, I'm going to return to the water and just wring my brush out just a little. You should only have to go back for more color only at the very beginning. Notice how I keep spreading it out, creating the different values. You can return back for more color to darken the first value. It doesn't have to be perfect, but show me what you learned. So I just did my wet on wet value scale, and at the end you should have 6 sections. So now for the dry on dry value scale, you're going to wet your brush again, return for some color, put a lot of color on your brush so that your first value will be nice and dark. Going to wring out my brush just slightly. It's very easy to get too much water on your brush, so remember that less is better. All right. So what you'll be turning into me are these value scales. Make sure you have one wet on wet wash value scale and one wet on dry value scale with 2 different colors. This is important to do because it is not only showing me that you understand the material, but you are learning the process in which to watercolor paint. When we move on to our cool assignment of being picture book illustrators, you'll have the tools you need for success. I will even show you what happens when you add salt or vinegar to the water. So I look forward to seeing you in class.